You've been lied to. My friends, I warn you, we're about to experience a deep dive into virginity. This virginity is so deep, I don't know if you're going to be able to come out of it. We're going to talk history, we're going to talk magic, we're going to talk juggling, we're going to talk conjuring. So the topic of today's video is going to be the historical context of magicians being persecuted throughout history for performing magic tricks. Long established is the belief that magicians were persecuted because of the similarity of performance and conjuring to other more nefarious acts like demon worship and Satan stuff. So it seems to be common knowledge throughout history that magicians, because of the similarity in their performances and because you couldn't technically explain what they were doing and they were performing things to look like things that were otherwise impossible, were often compared to Satan worshippers. And because of this, they were killed, they were arrested, they were maimed. Today we're questioning that. So the reason I'm making this video is because of an article published by the University of Edinburgh. Now, I found a scholarly article that debates the idea of magicians being persecuted throughout history for their performances of magic. Now, this scholarly article was written by Peter Lamont as Modern Magic, the Illusion of Transformation and How It Was Done. So I will be pulling a lot from this particular article because I do think it's very interesting and relevant to the point that it's making, obviously, which is that magicians were not in fact persecuted and that is a myth. So Lamont starts with his abstract that in 1584, Reginald Scott claimed that jugglers of course being people that performed, so not necessarily people that threw stuff and never seen the shape of a woman's vagina, but also includes magicians and performers and illusionists and conjurers who performed magic tricks were mistaken for witches. The claim was repeated and later became the basis of the Victorian idea of modern magic. According to stage conjurers and writers on magic, modern magic was magic that was now understood to be an illusion. So the claim being that the concept of modern magic is set to be distinguished from old magic, which is the idea that demons or something nefarious was helping the magicians, were helping the magicians perform their tricks. So Peter is questioning the idea that modern magic has actually been around for way longer than we give it credit for. The claim continued to be repeated by amateur historians of magic who reinforced this idea of modern magic by citing cases of early modern jugglers who were persecuted as witches. In recent years, modern magic, as a distinctly modern form of magic that was understood to be illusion, has become a part of culture. And this next part is the reason why he decided to write this article and challenge the idea that magicians were persecuted. He goes to say that the view that magic tricks were mistaken for witchcraft, however, is not to be found in the historiography, highfalutin there, but I'll give it to you, of the early modern period. Indeed, it is a myth. When one examines how magic tricks and witchcrafts were compared, one sees that there is a clear distinction made between the two. So what Peter Lamont here is saying is that there was never this idea that they were intermingled, and if it was few and far between. There was always a distinction made between performance magic and witchcraft. He goes on to say, nevertheless, despite the lack of evidence, the myth continued to survive. It was used to justify the exposure of secrets, enhance Victorian conjurers' respectability, and fitted neatly within the modern narrative of rational progress. It persisted due to the uncritical reading of sources by some historians, whose examples of persecution were the result of misinterpretation. Thus, modern magic as a form of magic that was understood to be illusion was not a particularly modern phenomenon. Otherwise saying that the concept that we have of modern magic and the difference between that and witchcraft was actually a difference that was well understood by even people in the 1500s. So the modern perception is that no, these people were brain dead, they were inbred, they were idiots, they didn't understand the difference, they saw a magician do a card trick and they immediately jumped to witchcraft. Whereas the argument that Peter Lamont is making, and he makes very thoroughly throughout the entirety of the article, is that no, there was always a distinction. There's historical evidence to support the idea that people had a clear understanding that it was different between witchcraft and different between conjuring or performance of magic. I wasn't lying when the virginity ran deep in this one, my friends. The virginity is already coursing through my veins and I don't think I'm able to shake it. Now he goes to give an example by a magician named Thomas Brandon in the 1500s, where a picture of a dove was given to a king. Now the king was asked to point to a pigeon on a nearby roof, and they watched as he stabbed the picture with a knife. That pigeon later fell from the roof dead. Now, this is a story that he mentions was in Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. Now, Discovery of Witchcraft, we know, is one of the most, if not the most early take on magic that we have published, and it's an interesting way of seeing the perception of magicians back then. He mentions that the article claimed that people that witnessed Brandon's feat have believed that it was real, and this could still be the case. So this is what he's mentioning being the argument that Reginald Scott is making, that people believed at the time that that illusion was real. So he goes to say a direct quote from the book, which is, "If this or the like feat should be done by an old woman," Scott declared, "Evie Body would cry out for fear and faggot to burn the witch." It seems Reginald Scott would be burned at the stake in 2022 for his use of language, but alas, it had a different meaning then. And this is the introduction to the basis that the author is making, which is, as we see, the claim that magic tricks were mistaken for witchcraft continue to be made in a variety of contexts. So he goes on to challenge the idea that magic and witchcraft were linked, and that there's actually a clear distinction by the modern public, which was perceived to be less intelligent, of course, in comparison, but that they still were able to make the distinction between the two, and that they weren't linked as we perceive. Now, me personally, I long thought that magicians were persecuted because of their performances, which is why Reginald Scott had to publish his book. But he's going to go to argue that that perception of reality was to sell more books. It laid a good foundation as to a certain type of marketing, even back then, that, hey, these are the secrets of magicians that have been long persecuted, and this is how you could perform the same tricks that they're doing. So he makes a very compelling argument for that, which is a little bit interesting in the most virgin-y sense. And then it becomes a battle of the term modern magic. Modern magic, of course, being the idea that it is well known now in modern times that it is an illusion. And this is made in stark comparison to before modern magic was coined or believed, which is that magic was done through nefarious means. And also that it was common knowledge that magic was performed through nefarious means, meaning satanic rituals, demonic intervention, and things like that. And Peter Lamont goes on to mention that it was very difficult to find any evidence of modern jugglers of course being performers, being persecuted for witchcraft. He mentioned how Scott reveals how many magic tricks were done in the context of the book Discovery of Witchcraft, but he provided no evidence of anyone mistaking magic tricks for witchcraft. And one of the quotes that he uses from Reginald Scott is that he said that card tricks that were performed to the wonder and astonishment of simple beholders, which conceive that kind of illusion, but expect miracles and strange works. Such rhetoric was part of a larger argument that a natural thing could be made to seem supernatural. So the idea being that people wanted to see miracles. They wanted to see more impressive feats than just the old card tricks that they were used to seeing, which is funny because we assume that that's a modern thing, when in reality, this is something that's been going on even in the long before. And Peter Lamont, the author of this article, mentions that even the pigeon trick that he gave an example for, that magician wasn't persecuted. And furthermore, that Scott wasn't even present during that particular performance, and that he had only heard about it from 4 decades prior. And not only was he not persecuted, but he was also made a freeman of the city of London and was paid very handsomely by the king for his services. Lamont mentions here that surely if Scott wished to show that innocent performers were being accused of witchcraft, he could have found a better example. He then goes on to mention specific incidents where people were persecuted for performing magic tricks. And here's something that I love from reading this particular article, in that anytime he wants to undermine someone, he says amateur historian, which is great because in a scholarly article, amateur historian looks a lot better than historian fuckface. And he mentioned that some amateur historians give examples of magicians that were in fact persecuted for performing. One of these amateur historians was Sidney Clark, who wrote a book called Annals of Conjuring, which was published in 1928, which sought to describe the beginnings, progress, and modern development in the branch of entertainment. Clark goes on to describe a girl who in the 15th century had been charged with witchcraft in Cologne. She had torn a handkerchief into pieces and then immediately produced it as a whole, an entire piece of cloth. Clark also mentions in 1571 a juggler who did card tricks in Paris was in prison on charges of witchcraft. And then the last example they give is of Triscalinus, who had performed before King Charles IX of France when he caused finger rings to fly through the air. The company rose up against him and compelled him to confess satanic aid. And what I like about Lamont is that he goes in to discredit each and every single one of these examples. So he mentions the girl in Cologne that restored the handkerchief and says that the story had been told and then retold, and it's a third-hand account. Also, the young girl claimed that she was Joan of Arc resurrected by God. And when two parties were disputing the jurisdiction of the church, she boasted that she could secure the French throne for one of them. She carried weapons, drank excessively, and dressed in men's clothing. Since this woman would have claimed to be raised from the dead, she quite possibly claimed to possess magical powers. Indeed, this may even be why she resurrected the torn napkin and the broken glass, which is another trick that she performed. Nevertheless, whatever claims she may have made about the tricks that she had performed, the tricks were described by Nider, who is one of these witnesses, as frivolities, while there were clearly other reasons for her arrest. So it wasn't a trick that got her persecuted, it was a combination of a lot of behavioral problems. The next example that he gave was of the juggler in France who was arrested for his performances of a card trick. He goes on to mention that none of them provided sources and that the original source of this particular story is probably from a book from Jean Bodin's Dénomanie that mentions a sorcerer that involved a trick using a deck of cards, but it was hardly a conventional card trick. He mentions in 1571, according to Bodin, the sorcerer accosted a priest in front of his parishioners. He accused the priest of being a hypocrite who pretends to carry a breviary, which I had to look. It's also a very difficult word to pronounce. It's a book of prayer, but actually carries a pack of cards. When the priest showed that he was in fact carrying this book, he discovered what seemed to be a pack of cards, and others present thought this too. The priest then threw it away and left confused. However, when others picked up what he had thrown away, they discovered that it was in fact a book after all. They described this as an illusion in the sense that it did not really happen. The sorcerer had dazzled the eyes of the people, but only the people who had been there from the start experienced the illusion. Those who arrived later only saw a book. And Lamont, of course, mentions that this is just another game of telephone, where a story like that was then misconstrued further and further until it became something of an induced hallucination, a mass hallucination of people misremembering things and seeing something that actually wasn't there. He also goes on to mention, furthermore, we are told that the sorcerer was condemned for quite a different feat, which, as we shall see shortly, does not sound like magic trick either. He was not executed, but pardoned by the king on the condition that he revealed the names of fellow sorcerers. This may be an example of persecution, but it does not appear to be an example of persecution for performing a magic trick. And in the last part of the article, he goes on to challenge the distinction of the concept of modern magic, which of course is something that I've mentioned here often, but it's a very important distinction to make because that pretty much is the entire basis of his argument. Modern magic has technically always been around. He talks about even back then, people going to watch these shows and being aware that there's an element of sleight of hand, that they're watching a performance. Very few in the population thought that it was anything other than just sleight of hand performances. And he goes off to list several sources of that particular idea and challenges the concept that modern magic has technically been around longer than we give it credit for. I'm going to leave the link to the actual article in the description section below so you could take a look at it if you want. It is a deep rabbit hole that you may not climb out of. But I did find the whole premise interesting. That's this whole notion that magicians were persecuted and that we were really performing in the dark, and people thought in mass that what they were doing was linked with devil worship and witchcraft, that was actually a farce. It's a very interesting point, and he does cite it with a lot of sources. And I, of course, had the same idea because of magic books, that magicians were persecuted. They were finding interesting and novel ways to perform while also trying their best not to be persecuted for performance because of the connection to witchcraft. And the idea that Reginald Scott came up with his book because he wanted to show that people were using magic methods. They were using actual conjuring tricks. They weren't necessarily resorting to witchcraft. And I think that the author, Peter Lamont, does a great job at challenging this notion. Oh boy, is the virginity deep. My friends, make sure to check out the PigCake Magic Academy. If you're interested in learning some stuff, right? Learning some magic tricks, learning some bits, some by-play, coin stuff, card stuff, there's mentalism. The link is in the description section below. Very cheap, right? Manageable. People always tell me I should charge more, but then they go, hey, this is the best bargain in magic subscription services. Why not? Why not? Over 1,000 videos, and I upload every single week. So might as well check that out. Also great of me to mention that at the latter part of the video, right? Most people have already checked out, but that shows you my business acumen.
I see you again, when 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 I see you again. see you again, when I see you again.